Welcome back, everybody, to another deep dive. I am so excited about today's topic. We are cracking open a chapter from, well, a legend in our field, B.F. Skinner, and his book, Science and Human Behavior.
You know, you can't go wrong with Skinner. It's a classic for a reason.
Absolutely. And today we're going deep into motivation and behavior, but specifically how Skinner breaks down these concepts. Because honestly, sometimes I think we're all talking about the same things, but using different words.
Oh, for sure. I've seen that so many times, especially when we're trying to, really pinpoint what's driving someone's behavior.
Right. Like we throw around terms like motivation and drives, but are we even on the same page about what those words mean, especially in the context of ABA?
Exactly. So maybe we should start by defining some terms, lay the groundwork. When we talk about things like deprivation and satiation in ABA, what are we really getting at?
Yeah, that's a great place to start. So when we talk about deprivation and satiation, we're not just talking about basic needs like food or water, right?
Right. Think about how good that first sip of water tastes when you're really parched.
Oh yeah, pure bliss.
Right. Total satiation. But then on the flip side, think about that feeling you get when you've been stuck inside all day, like that restlessness.
Oh, cabin fever.
Exactly. And that's a form of deprivation too, but it's not about a lack of food or water.
So it's broader than that, but how does this all tie back to behavior? Like, why should our listeners, especially those working in ABA, care about these concepts?
Okay, well, because understanding deprivation and satiation gives us this really powerful way to understand why people do the things they do. And for ABA professionals, it's super important for developing effective behavior change strategies.
Oh, I see where you're going with this. So, like, if someone's deprived of something, they're going to be way more motivated to get it.
Exactly. And that's why that first sip of water is so satisfying when you're thirsty. Your body is in a state of deprivation, so that water becomes a super strong reinforcer.
Okay, that makes sense. So we can actually use these states, these levels of deprivation or satiation, to kind of nudge someone toward learning a new skill or changing a behavior.
Absolutely, yeah. And it helps us avoid falling into this trap of relying on these vague, kind of wishy-washy ideas about drives, which, Skinner really pushes back against.
Yeah, that's one thing I always loved about Skinner. He really challenges us to think critically about the language we use.
Totally.
Yeah, right.
He argues that these drives we often talk about aren't these internal forces that are, pushing us around. They can't be pinned down as some specific stimulus or even like a physiological state.
Wait, hold on. Are you saying things like hunger and thirst aren't real? Because I definitely feel those.
Oh, no, not at all. Of course you feel those sensations, but Skinner's point is that we often make this jump in logic when we try to use those feelings to explain behavior.
Okay, I think I'm following you. So, I might feel hungry, but that feeling of hunger isn't the only thing that makes me go eat lunch.
Right. It might be a signal, but the actual reason you eat lunch is much more complicated.
Right, like what's available to eat, when I last ate, maybe even social cues. It's all kind of mixed in there.
Exactly. And I think this really makes us rethink how we talk about motivation in general. We say things like, oh, she's got this drive to succeed, as if it's this thing inside her pushing her forward.
Yeah, like it's some kind of magical internal engine.
Yeah. But what Skinner is suggesting is that we need to shift our focus away from those, imagined internal drives, and instead look at what's actually observable, the environmental factors that are shaping behavior.
Okay, so less about what's going on inside and more about what's going on around the person.
Precisely. And that's where the idea of deprivation and satiation becomes so crucial. Instead of trying to, decipher someone's internal drive, we can just look at their history with a particular reinforcer, see how that's influencing their current behavior.
Okay, this is starting to click for me now. So instead of asking, what's driving this person's behavior, we're asking, what's their history with this specific reinforcer, and how can we use that information to help create meaningful change?
You got it. And the thing is, this shift in thinking can be super liberating because it gives us this practical, actionable framework for addressing challenging behaviors.
I'm already thinking about past cases in a whole new light. But before we go too far down that road, I want to make sure we're being clear with our listeners. We're saying that understanding deprivation and satiation can help us in ABA, but how do we do that ethically? We can't just go around depriving people of things. Right?
Oh, absolutely not. You're totally right. Ethical consideration should always be front and center, guiding everything we do.
So how do we find that balance? How do we make sure we're using these concepts effectively, but also doing what's best for the people we're working with?
That's a great question, and it's something we're going to dig into later in this deep dive. But first, I think it would be helpful to look at how these ideas actually play out in everyday life. Skinner gives us some really interesting examples in the text that might help shed light on how we can use these principles ethically and effectively.
Oh, I'm all ears. Let's get into those examples and see how it all comes together.
Okay, so picture this. Skinner talks about how delaying a meal can actually make us enjoy food more.
Oh, yeah, totally.
Like when you're really hungry, that first bite is just
Amazing.
the best, right? And it's because the longer you go without food, the more deprived you are, the more powerful food is as a reinforcer.
It's not just about needing the food. It's like the whole experience is heightened, right?
Exactly.
I could see how that could be really helpful, like when you're working with someone who has a hard time getting excited about certain activities,
Oh, for sure. And it's not just limited to food either.
Yeah, what else?
Like, think about how kids play with their toys. If they have access to all their toys all the time, they get bored so quickly.
Well, oh, yeah. Yeah, that's true.
But if you just give them 1 or 2 toys at a time...
They're suddenly fascinated.
Exactly. So it's like this built-in system.
Scarcity equals value.
Yeah, and this is something we can use, in so many settings: classrooms, homes, therapy sessions.
It's all about managing those reinforcers, making them more effective.
Exactly. Now, you might be thinking, okay, this all makes sense with basic needs, but what about things like praise or money?
Right. Those aren't like essential for survival.
Yeah, that's where conditioned reinforcers come in.
Okay, tell me more.
So conditioned reinforcers, they're things that get their power through association with those primary reinforcers.
Okay, so they piggyback off the important stuff.
Yeah, exactly. Like money by itself doesn't have any value, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we learn to associate it with the things we can get with it.
Food, shelter, the things we actually need.
Right, and then it becomes valuable to us because of that connection.
And it's the same with praise or attention.
Exactly. We learn to associate those with positive experiences, so they become reinforcing, even if they're not meeting a biological need directly.
So that brings up an interesting question. Does that mean we have separate drives for things like attention or money? Like, is there an attention drive?
It's tempting to think that way, isn't it?
It does kind of make sense. I mean, you see people doing all sorts of things to get attention or make money.
I get it, but Skinner... he actually argues against the idea that we have these separate drives for those generalized reinforcers.
So it's not that someone is just like driven by this insatiable need for attention.
Right. Instead of focusing on some internal drive, we need to look at their learning history.
You mean like what experiences have they had that made attention so important to them?
Exactly. Like how has that connection between attention and those primary reinforcers been strengthened over time?
Okay, so it's more about how those generalized reinforcers got linked to the really important stuff. But how do you untangle those connections? Especially when you're working with someone who can't necessarily tell you about their past experiences.
That's where the real detective work comes in, right? Careful observation, assessment.
Looking for patterns.
Exactly. What seems to be reinforcing for this person? How is that connected to those primary reinforcers? It's like putting together a puzzle.
That takes a lot of skill.
Absolutely, yeah. And, a willingness to be wrong sometimes. Your initial hypothesis about what's motivating the behavior, it might not always be right. You have to be ready to adjust.
That's the beauty of ABA, right? It's all about the data.
Exactly. Okay, so we've talked about how these concepts of deprivation and satiation can help us understand and even predict behavior. We've talked about those conditioned reinforcers, but what about the challenges?
You mentioned earlier about those epical considerations.
Yeah, for sure. And that's a big one, making sure we're using these powerful principles responsibly.
Because deprivation can be a powerful tool, but it has to be used carefully.
Right. We have to constantly be checking ourselves. Are we meeting the individual's basic needs? Are we respecting their autonomy? Is what we're doing actually therapeutic?
Those aren't always easy questions to answer.
Nope, not always black and white.
So it's not just about knowing the mechanics of these concepts. It's about using them in a way that's truly ethical.
Right. And another challenge is accurately identifying what deprivations are actually at play, driving a particular behavior.
That makes sense. It's not always going to be obvious.
Sometimes the individual might not even be able to tell you what they need, or maybe there are a bunch of different things happening at once.
Right, like it's rarely just one thing.
Exactly. And then even when you think you've got it figured out, there's the challenge of manipulating those conditions in a way that actually works and is still ethical.
It's a lot to juggle.
It is. It is. It really requires us to be in constant discussion, as a community.
Sharing experiences, learning from each other.
Yeah, so we can keep refining our understanding and making sure we're using these concepts in the most effective and ethical way possible.
This has been really insightful. I feel like I have a much better grasp on this whole idea of deprivation and satiation now.
Me too. It's always great to dive into these topics with other ABA folks.
Before we wrap up, though, you mentioned something earlier about Skinner talking about time as a variable in motivation.
Oh, right, yeah. That's an important one, and it's something that often gets overlooked.
So how does time play into all of this?
Well, think about it this way. We've been talking about how deprivation makes a reinforcer more valuable and how satiation makes it less so. But time, just time passing, can also change how motivating something is.
That's interesting. I hadn't really thought of it that way before.
Yeah, it's kind of subtle. Okay, imagine you just had a big lunch.
Okay, stuffed.
Right. You're totally satiated, can't even think about another bite. But then, a few hours later...
Oh, then I'm ready for a snack for sure.
Exactly. Even though you were completely full just a few hours ago, time has passed, and now you're in a different state of deprivation.
So the longer it's been since I ate, the more appealing food becomes again.
Exactly. And this isn't just about food. We see it with all sorts of things, sleep, social interaction, even physical activity.
So time is like this hidden factor that's always influencing how motivated we are, even if we don't realize it.
Yeah, it's always there in the background. And Skinner actually points out that this is especially important for behaviors that are what he calls automatically satiating, meaning the more you do them, the less you want to do them.
Okay, I'm not sure I follow. Can you give me an example?
He uses the example of exercise. Like, if you keep a rat in a small cage for a while, it's going to be super active when you first let it out.
Right, yeah, yes, zoomies.
Exactly. But then as it runs around and gets that exercise, it's not as motivated to keep going.
Oh, that makes sense. Like my dog, if he's been inside all day, he'll go crazy in the yard at first, but after a while, he's done.
Right. The act of running around is actually satiating in itself. So as the rat or your dog does more of it, the motivation to keep doing it goes down.
So the longer the deprivation, the more intense that initial burst of activity is, but then the activity itself starts to, fulfill that need. That's really cool.
It is, right. And it brings up this whole other concept, periodicity in behavior.
Periodicity.
Yeah, think about things like eating, sleeping, drinking.
Oh, right. We tend to do those things at certain times.
Exactly. It's like our bodies have these built-in schedules.
That's a good point. I mean, knowing that someone tends to get hungry around noon, you could kind of predict that they might be more likely to, start looking for food around that time.
Right. But it also makes you wonder, how much control do we really have over our behavior if so much of it is tied to these biological rhythms and just the passage of time?
That's a great question. Are we really in the driver's seat, or is it more complicated than that?
I think it's definitely more complicated. We're not just products of our environment. We're also biological beings. And those internal drives, those rhythms, they definitely play a role.
So it's this back and forth between nature and nurture. Our biology kind of sets us up, but our experiences determine how those tendencies play out.
Exactly. And as ABA professionals, I think it's our responsibility to understand both sides of that coin.
Right. To look at the whole picture, biology, learning history, and what's going on in the environment right now.
Absolutely.
This deep dive has really been eye-opening. I feel like we've covered so much ground, debunked some myths about drives, dug into the nuances of deprivation and satiation, even explored the role of time and motivation.
It's been a great discussion, and I hope our listeners are walking away with some new insights into how these concepts can be applied, not just in their work, but in their everyday lives, too.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And to leave everyone with one final thought from Skinner, he suggested that even time itself can be a source of deprivation, like all the things we do to kill time. Could those be attempts to escape from having too much time on our hands? Something to ponder. Thanks for joining us for another deep dive.
Until next time.